So I actually, as you may be able to tell from my last name, I am from a Latin American heritage. I'm actually Brazilian and left when I was quite young, but I've spoken Portuguese at home with my family my whole life. I also translate from Portuguese, more Brazilian Portuguese than other Portugueses. But I lived in Mexico as well from the age of 8 to 13 and became fluent quite quickly, even though my Spanish can be a little dated to the late 90s, early 2000s. And then I kept moving around and I also picked up a few other languages. And I'd always enjoyed the almost like the physical act of writing, of putting words together into a sentence, but wasn't especially drawn to the idea of creating characters or saying anything. I feel like the responsibility of saying things is huge, and I've always found it quite intimidating, and therefore I have mountains of admiration for writers. And at some point in college, I was doing a few creative writing classes, and it became clear to me that people did this thing called translation. I was doing my final paper on a Brazilian modernist novel called Macunaíma, which has been recently retranslated by Katrina Dodson and issued by New Directions, and a modernist piece of fiction, like prose poetry from the Harlem Renaissance by Jean Toomer. And in order to do this, I actually had to work from an English translation because people didn't understand, like people within my academic setting didn't have that many languages. And so I had to refer to an English text. And I think that's when I realized the potential of translation, like how many different versions you can create of a text, because I was reading this book and having a different experience from the one created by, I can't even remember the name of the translator. It was published in the 50s or 60s, I believe. And I started translating to share with my friends poems by Brazilian authors that I liked, and got completely hooked in that kind of close reading and that kind of writing. And the rest, I guess, is is history.
Okay, so a couple things. First of all, like being fluent in Portuguese makes it easier to get fluent in Spanish. I mean, those languages are...
I'd say it probably helps, but then you have all the static, right? You have a lot of false friends between Portuguese and Spanish that mean you have to be very careful when you're reading in Spanish to make sure that the Portuguese isn't getting in the way of what you're reading. I think what really helped was being thrown into a Spanish-speaking context when my brain was very malleable and spongy and could just absorb whatever it came into contact with.
But you mentioned that a lot of your Spanish is sort of stuck in the late 90s or whatever, and it brought to mind this idea that, like, you know, languages are like living entities. They're constantly mutating. They're constantly adapting and responding to circumstances on the ground, right? It's not just like you learn it in 1998 and you're good. I mean, in some ways you're good, but to remain current and to be able, I would imagine, as a translator, to respond to vernacular in a text, it's helpful to be there.
Yeah, definitely. But there are other ways of staying in contact, especially nowadays. I have a lot of friends from Mexico. I I consume a lot of culture, be it music or television, cinema or literature, from all of the places that I translate from. So I translate from a broad spread. My Spanish was extra complicated by the fact that I then moved to Barcelona and picked up the Iberian, certain Iberian terms, but also spent a huge amount of time with Colombians and picked up Colombian slang on top of more current Mexican slang. So my Spanish is a bit of a salad.
But that's good, right? Does that help
I
you?
think so.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it would, like by layering, it would only make your understanding of the language stronger. And you mentioned a bit ago that you also picked up additional languages. So how many languages do you speak?
I speak English, Portuguese, and Spanish very, very comfortably. And then I also speak Catalan and French.
Catalan and French. And me with my Duolingo doing one lesson a day. Is there any hope for me? I want to be fluent in
No,
it.
not if you just do Duolingo.
What do I got to do to become? I want to speak other languages so badly. I would love to be fluent in multiple languages.
Well, Heather is a language teacher as well, so she might have some pointers. But generally speaking, going to that place and having no choice really, really speeds up the language acquisition process.
Yeah, just full immersion. So, Heather, that brings us to you. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how you wound up in the world of literary translation?
Sure, absolutely. I actually stumbled into it completely by accident. I was also in college, and I was in my senior year doing a degree in comparative literature and trying to write an honors thesis about detective fiction. And it just was not coming together. I was getting very frustrated. And at the time, I was working at the front desk as a student worker, and I expressed this frustration to a professor at the college named Richard Seaberth, who's a very well-known translator from French and German. And he said, "Well, why don't you try a translation? I'll be your advisor." And I was like, that sounds fine. I'll try that. And of course, I picked a play by Federico Garcia Lorca that he had written in rhymed verse for my first translation project, because with all the hubris of youth. But it's funny that Julia used the phrase that she was hooked, because I remember very vividly, like the first night that I sat down to actually work on this project, I think I translated 7 hours straight. I looked at the clock, it was 4:30 in the morning, and I just hadn't stopped. And I absolutely loved it. I love kind of some of the things that Julia describes are also some of the aspects of translation that resonate most with me. I also love the way that it's kind of like a puzzle, that it feels like there is a solution, and even though there are multiple solutions to any given translation problem, it feels like something that you can continue to kind of work with until you find it. And yeah, so that was how I got started. And then from that moment on, I kind of reorganized my life around translation. So I did a master's degree in comparative literature, and then went on to study actually contemporary Latin American literature rather than translation per se, but always with the idea of sort of becoming, because I think one of the things that Julia hinted at, and we may come back to, is a really important part of translation for me is fully understanding the context from which any given work comes from. So understanding sort of the other texts that it's in conversation with, understanding how the language of a text deviates or adheres to like certain genre norms or certain linguistic norms. And so that the path that I followed in sort of preparation for becoming a translator was really trying to understand the landscape of the contemporary literatures that most interested me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I get that, like the puzzle aspect of it, this feeling of there is a right answer, or like the rightest answer to a translation problem, where you're reading a text in its original form and trying to find the right words in English. And I can imagine how satisfying that must be when you get it right. And it is a creative act. That's the thing about it. It's like, I don't think people, a lot of people don't spend much time thinking about the work of literary translators, but it's not just a automatic process where you know a language and you're just reading the original text and then writing out the translation. It's much slower than that, I would imagine. Right?
Absolutely. Sometimes I think about how if literary translation were just about knowing two languages really well and writing well in the language you're translating into, then we'd have a lot more translators. Just because, I mean, it's very possible that we're very unique in our enjoyment of translation. Like we both find it very pleasurable, but I think there's something else. I think there's a degree of obsessiveness that translators have. We can truly beat a horse to death and then keep going.
Are you obsessive,
Julia,
both of you? Have you compared notes on this? You guys are both the same.
well, Julia and I actually, this is another thing that we may talk about. We've worked together how many years now? Like six or 7 years. Julia and I have been collaborators and workshop partners, and we have literally spent 40 minutes in a workshop over a single comma, like talking about the implications for rhythm and breath and meaning, whether it goes, whether it stays. I mean, just to give one example.
Are you guys like, I'm curious if this obsessiveness is part of other aspects of your life. Like, do you both live in like very clean houses or something?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Okay, good.
Well, I'm a little bit more, but not
Yes.
not all.
Yes, you are. Quite a lot, a bit more.
So,
Okay, I'm a lot more. Okay.
So not only is it interesting and somewhat unique that you are each literary translators, like that alone, I think, as I've said, it's like a specialized pursuit and a skill set that most people don't have. But you also work in collaboration. So like on Reservoir Bitches, you guys are co-translators on this story collection. Why? And I'll let you, Heather, answer first.
I'm glad because I get to say it because I'm Julia's super fan. And, and I mean, like I said, we have a long-standing sort of collaborative dynamic, but have never formally worked together. And we both kind of came to Dahlia's work through different channels. And Julia was invited to translate the book, and she extended an invitation to me to work with her on it very generously. And I don't know, I had a blast doing it. It was really fun.
Okay, so here's a question, Julia. Like, since you guys have worked individually as translators, I would imagine on other projects, what was different about working in collaboration on a translation? Like, what did it bring to bear on the text that might not have been there had you gone it alone?
That's a tough question. I think I mean, every translation is very fun, but having someone who you meet with on, in this case, it was Zoom, like once every couple of weeks to exchange ideas, having a close reader of your own, like of the manifestation of your own close reading of a text is really rewarding. And on top of that, I have also been a fan of Heather. I knew who Heather Cleary was before I even met her and became friends with Heather. And I think, I don't know if you can teach writing. I'm not sure you can teach translation either, but what you can do is translate with peers and learn from their own acts of translation. And so, at least on my part, the experience of translating, it was all the richer for that. In terms of what the reader will get in their hands, we were very lucky in that we were co-translating a book of short stories with extremely different voices. And so we actually divvied up the stories in a way that made a lot of sense for us, where Heather translated some of the pieces of the higher class Mexican
I got the fresas.
women.
She gave me the fresas.
She got the fresas.
Why?
She chose them. To be fair, I think she really enjoyed the voices, and I think maybe Heather needs to answer that question. Actually,
I don't know exactly why. I think just to kind of go back a little bit, one of the things that I think that co-translating this book in particular brought to it is that because the voices are so different and because the language is so colloquial, Julia and I were able to sort of be checks and balances for each other in terms of our own cultural references, because we each have these sort of like deeply ingrained mixtures of the culture we consumed as young people, the different sort of places we've lived and the slang we've heard. I grew up in New York City. So I had like in the 80s and 90s, right? So I had a certain sort of frame of reference that maybe included LA. Julia had a different set of references. And so when we were trying to kind of patch together these different colloquial voices, trying not to have them too anchored in any specific place, which is something that Julia speaks about really beautifully. I'll leave that as like a parentheses to come back to. We were able to kind of fill each other's gaps in a little bit in terms of our knowledge and our language use. And so for me, I think I just, like, having watched Clueless and things like that, like I felt like much more sort of comfortable in this like range of the sort of upper class, very unself-aware, privileged woman. I felt like I had more sort of cultural material to draw from, and I found them funny and monstrous in a way that I thought could be useful in the translation.
And what was this word that you used to? It was a fresa. Frejas. What is
Fresa.
it? A fresa. What is a fresa?
A fresa is, one, a strawberry, but two, just a sort of upper class person, either a woman or a man. There are different terms depending where you are in Latin America, and fresa is for Mexico specifically. I think in Bogota it's gomelo. I cannot explain that one. In British English, you'd say someone who's posh.
Right.
It kind of touches on preppy, but it goes beyond that because, wealth, it also looks different in different places. And wealth in Mexico looks very different than it does in, say, New York City.
And as you said earlier, this collection of Dahlias features a range of characters from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds and life circumstances. It's a range of women, female characters. Mm-hmm. And when you talked about the tandem approach to translation that you guys took, I am curious, it sounds like it was kind of a divide and conquer, but then you would go over each other's work. You would divide, Heather would do one batch of stories, Julie would do another batch of stories, but then you would swap when you were done, and you would sort of then have a commiseration process that happened. Here's a question though. Were there ever any heated debates over translation? Did you guys ever have really strong differences of opinion about how something should sound or what words should be used? And before I let you answer, I want to predict your response based on something you've already said. If translation is, to use this comparison, like putting together a puzzle, I'm imagining the two of you are working on a jigsaw puzzle together. And with the jigsaw puzzle, there's really not much room for debate. The piece either fits or it doesn't. Maybe you'll quibble a little bit about a word, but if the piece locks into place, the piece locks into place. So I'm imagining that this was not a heated, contentious, creative process between the two of you, or was it?
I would say it wasn't, but I would say it wasn't because we are very good at listening to each other and giving when, sort of saying, okay, you believe strongly in this choice and we're going to go for it because I believe in your belief in that choice. And so maybe in that respect, a jigsaw puzzle is not the right kind of puzzle. It could be a jigsaw puzzle in a multiverse where the puzzle pieces change as you play it.
Heather, do you have something to add?
That's totally it. It is a jigsaw puzzle in the multiverse, because even though there are translation solutions that are more right than others, there's not a single right answer. Right. And the way that a translator gets to what they believe is the best answer has to do with the way they're hearing things when they read the original, has to do with the way they kind of understand the landscape of the book in general, and also the specific sentence. There's so many subjective layers that go into sort of what rightness is, that when you have two people who are trained at close reading and trained at sort of rendering and the creative act of rewriting a book in another language, there are going to be divergences. And I mean, yeah, it's funny also when you talk to translators who are reading translations of the languages that they work in. Like, you have a lot of like Monday morning quarterbacking, even like, oh, I think blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we did disagree about some things, but they were really, really interesting conversations. And they always led to a deeper understanding of the text for both of us, no matter whose initial impulse ended up appearing on the page. And so we would go back and forth. I would give Julia my drafts. She would give me her drafts. We'd go over them. And then we started mixing. And we started, in the later passes of the whole collection, we would edit the whole thing together, all the way through. So it actually, like, by the end, I don't know if this happened to you, Julia, but I stopped remembering whose choices were whose. Like, I couldn't tell anymore, like, who had proposed what.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember what stories I did and what stories you did, just because it's a very clear line that I can draw between them, in like almost a socioeconomic line. But I do not remember on the sentence level who did what when. And yeah, the other thing that was a joy in co-translating, and I think is a merit to the translation that readers will actually hold in their hands, is that because we had these checks and balances, it meant that we also had this permission every so often to just go for a really kooky solution that we might not have felt confident enough to do on our own.
You guys
I'm thinking about a poodle specifically.
Wait, what is this poodle?
I can't even remember what the original is anymore.
It was an insult. It was in one of the like Fresa stories. And she wants to like throw out an insult at someone that she considers to be beneath her. And the phrase in Spanish was very colloquial, but also kind of creative. Like it had like a little twist to a standard colloquial phrase. And Julia actually was the one who came up with something you fucking poodle or something like that. It works so beautifully.
I found it. I have the document in front of me. May I?
You may.
Please.
So someone says, you can't carry pedigree in a wallet. Oh, wait, sorry. Let me start over. You can't carry pedigree in a wallet, one of the girls hissed. You can take your pedigree and shove it, you stupid fucking poodle. I would like you to know there are no poodles in the original, but how could we not? Because she's talking about like these upper class posh girls, and the poodle has so many sort of implications about like this almost ridiculous pet that has been deformed by people's wealth, and like it having to look in a specific like bubbly way. I don't know. Poodle was really fun, and I'm not sure I would have felt confident enough to do that on my own, but having Heather there being as excited as me about including this poodle in this story was great.
So what you're saying is that you enabled each other.
We did. Completely.
Absolutely.
Completely. And I think, but also to kind of look at the flip side. So that story actually it wasn't Regina, it's from Juliana. And Juliana is the daughter of like a drug kingpin. And she ascends to the throne. But she experiences a lot of prejudice among her classmates in these like posh schools that she attends because she's nouveau riche. And for them, that's just like the worst. And she's not blonde, which is terrible. And so that response of like, you fucking poodle, actually does make sense in this context of the tensions, even among a certain demographic, like in terms of wealth, right? There were these tensions. But Julia chose some of the other voices because you have now kind of created a niche for yourself in translating colloquial, like Giovanni Martins, right?
Yes, I have dug myself into a very thorny, difficult niche of translating novels written in working class vernaculars.
Okay. I'm so thrilled to hear you say this, because my introduction to the art of translating, like the place where I had sort of like my earliest epiphany about what a great translator can do for a work, was when I read Journey to the End of the Night by Louis Ferdinand Céline, who I always have to say is problematic as a human being, but this novel is got a lot of merit to it. And the translation by Ralph Manheim, like, was so startling to me because I read this book in the early aughts. I think I was like a young, brooding guy, like right after 9/11. And I was like, I'm going to read like the heaviest French literature I can, like just to put myself in time and space or whatever. But the book, like I think, which was published in the early 1930s, read as if it had been written yesterday. And it was famously difficult to translate because it was written in its original form in the French argot. It was known for being very vernacular, and it was the language of the streets, right? The language of like the commoners in France at that time. And yet Mannheim was able to really do it. And so this text benefited greatly. I mean, the translation is so vital and is still read because of that. And subsequently, I've read books translated that were disappointing and felt a lot less vital. So I think I've read bad translations too. And once you've read a really good one, or what seems to you to be a really good one, and once you've read a really bad one, I think it deepens your appreciation for the good ones, right? And I have to believe that translating from the argot is a bigger challenge. Like, what do you have to do to bring yourself up to speed on that language? Or is it just slower? Does it just require more research and maybe reaching out to friends who might have insight? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is the process for you?
All of the above.
All of the above.
It is a lot slower. It does involve a lot of reaching out to friends, and it does involve a lot of consuming of television. For me specifically, I consume a lot of television and cinema to get more contemporary turns of phrases and slang, because I get the feeling that U.S. literature just doesn't do working class narratives and working class voices as much as other literatures, certainly not as much as in Brazil and other Latin American countries. And there's a revival as well in Spain. I think in part because of the success of Latin American working class narratives. And there's a strong tradition in the United Kingdom with like Irvin Welsh and, oh God, was it James Kelman, Scottish and Irish writers. But in the US, it's really hard to find that kind of literature. And and it's also such a large country that it will vary so much depending on if you're reading a writer from California or Tennessee or North Dakota, say. I think Heather sort of talked a little about this earlier. And when you're translating vernacular, you don't want the vernacular you use to be too overly attached to a place. I obviously, as someone who speaks U.S. English, am going to translate into U.S. English. I wouldn't even attempt to translate into British English because I would sound like a bad American actor doing a bad British accent. And it's not natural to me, even though I spent some time living in the United Kingdom. So what you want to do is you really want to create an illusion. You want to create an illusion that the people in this book speak like this, that the vernacular that you have put on the page could be how characters in an English-speaking Rio de Janeiro would sound. So it's creating the illusion and also sustaining it and hoping that the reader suspends their disbelief. And it's difficult because it is you're like constantly dodging like mines, not wanting to not wanting to make it sound too New York, but then also not wanting to make it sound too hokey. You want to be respectful of the voices. And there's been a lot of, I don't know, bad spoofs of working class voices, sort of attempts to add authenticity that fall short. It's a niche that I'm trying to dig myself out of because it's so difficult.
Well, but I mean, yeah, it's like I'm thinking of this little, this gray area in between the original text and the English speaking native reader, let's say in the United States, who's picking up this work in translation. I can imagine the challenge of dealing with a book that is written in like a working class vernacular specific to Mexico, or even like a specific part of Mexico, and then bringing that to an English reader and wanting the read to be like, like accurate and to honor the original, but also to be satisfying to the person reading it in English. And that's the gray area, right? I mean, you're picking words and turns of phrase that you don't want to dishonor the original, but you also want it to be palatable to the person reading it in translation. And that's the judgment call that you have to make. Like, that's the art of translation.
I think so. I would like to use the word thrilling instead of palatable. Palatable is so polite. You really want
trying
it to
be polite.
You want it to be, gripping, not to use an overused word in like literary marketing and publicity. But you really want to grab the reader and hold them. The problem being you cannot please everyone, and someone is going to take issue with one of your choices because we all come with our baggage and with our tastes. And obviously, in Portuguese, my mother has always said that it's impossible to please both Greeks and Trojans. So yeah.
Heather,
sorry, I just jumped in there, Heather.
No.
Do you have anything to add, Heather?
No, I mean, I think, I think that palatability or whether it's gripping or whether it's disconcerting I think with Dahlia's work, she does several things at once. And one of them is also to be a little bit unpalatable. Part of Dahlia's politics is to write a bit against the grain of what polite society expects to see on the page. And I should take out a bit because that's what she's doing. She's she's got a very, as you see, as you've read in the book. And so our job in this project was to recreate that as well, to have like a como desafiante, like a sort of a defiant tone a little bit in the prose in English. And that is a delicate line to walk because Laurie Chamberlain has this great line in one of her essays about translation that translation is often found guilty for crimes that an original cannot be tried for, right? So if you're reading Dahlia in the Spanish and there's kind of a non-standard use of language or an uncomfortable image or an uncomfortable sentence aesthetically, right? You take that as part of the project of the book. But for the translators, we have to figure out how to make those choices be both uncomfortable and convincing in English.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I think I was getting at, is like trying to bridge that divide and make it work without losing the essence of the original. And you talk about Dahlia's, like, her work and the energy of it. I mean, it's called Reservoir Bitches. You sort of know from the front a little bit of what you're getting, right?
Yes, you do.
And I gotta say too, that the work that you guys do, like you talk about how obsessive you are and how immersive the process of translation is for you, and how like intellectually stimulating it is and creatively stimulating it is. I think like as an ancillary benefit, or maybe a benefit of the process that might not get as much airtime, is like what a cultural education you get in having to delve into these works and into these like very specific parts of countries. Do you know what I'm saying? Like the specific subcultures within the culture that you are sort of forced to get an education in if you want to do the work well. That has to be so like edifying. That has to be part, like that's a benefit. I'm sure it's also a challenge, but you get such a benefit from it, right?
Yeah. I mean, not just culturally. I mean, yes, culturally, but also micro. We become experts in micro topics for every project, right? In this particular one, Julia and I went down a really hardcore rabbit hole of like the plastic surgeries that women get, particularly women associated with sort of narco culture known as buchonas. There's like a very sort of a semi-standard series of operations that women will get to appear in a certain way. And there's many references to these surgeries in the stories, or at least a couple of them. And so Julia and I went down a long, long research rabbit hole of like what these surgeries are properly called, like what they entail, what kind of healing times are involved. Because these were sort of like little references here and there, and we needed to be able to understand what was behind them. Do you know what I mean? It was just one thing. What else did we?
Corridos.
A ton.
Dahlia leans on a lot of music. I mean, music is just integral to her writing. And there's a specific genre of music in Mexico called corridos, which I'm not even sure I can explain properly, but some of them are based on real events.
They're a lot like epic poetry, honestly.
Yeah.
Like they're narrative in style, and they tend to celebrate the life or acts of a prominent figure, often in narco culture.
And so we would go down these rabbit holes trying to dig up the people who are being sung about in the corridos referenced in particular songs and stories. And I mean, Dahlia has an entire Spotify playlist that we listen to on repeat for this book. And then there are sort of, there's the high production songs and the lower production songs with really, really charming, low budget music videos that I watched on repeat to try to make sense of how the events of the song may be played into the events on the page. The rabbit holes are really, really joyful. And I kind of wish that we got an extra stipend just to spend more time in those rabbit holes.
I can imagine. And it's also sparking like this realization for me that, so many writers, myself included, like use music to like access maybe like the mood of a piece, or to give, I don't know, it's like an emotional prompt almost when you sit down to write. And I've talked to many writers who might listen to the same piece of music on repeat, or the same cycle of music on repeat throughout the entire composition of a book, simply because it helps them access it. It's like a point of entry. And I could imagine how, as translators, if you have access to the music that a writer uses or used to compose the original, that it might help you in the translation in some way. It might give you things that you weren't even expecting to get.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's wild. So where have you guys? I mean, Julia, you told me you've lived all over the place, which is a good thing
Yes.
for a translator to have done. How though? Like, how do you get all over the world? Like living in the United Kingdom, living in Barcelona, living in. I mean, I know you have family roots in Brazil. You lived in Mexico. I'm imagining as a child because of your family moved there, but you've been all over.
Global capitalism. My dad worked for a big corporation that moved us every few years. And then I just got bit by the bug and have itchy feet and start. What's that movie with Juliette Binoche where like the wind blows and suddenly she feels she has to pack up and leave? It's very corny, but anyway, there's no blowing of wind. But I'm not terribly good at tourism. I don't especially like traveling to places and staying at a hotel and visiting and seeing the sights. I like to spend 6 months living in a place, at the very least 6 months. I don't think that that living in a ton of places is totally necessary for translators, but I do think that it almost sort of set the course of what I would do in my life. I can't imagine doing anything else, which is a terrifying thought because I'm doing quite well right now professionally, I feel, and I just am waiting for like the ground to fall beneath me, and I hope it doesn't happen. But you never know because I'd have to pick up some other skill, and I don't know what that would be.
I know that feeling. But I think it's such a practical and necessary skill. I feel like American readers would do well to read more books in translation. I feel like that's a part of the American literary spectrum that needs to be strengthened. So hopefully there will be a widening market. Hopefully you'll have more opportunities in the days to come.
That's the hope. I think just a quick point is that it's not just for American readers. I feel like it's for American literature in general that it would be good to have more translation, because literature and translation, it's not only that it teaches you about new cultures and has this anthropological gift, but it does inject new ways of doing literature into a language. And most other places actually translate a large amount, and the US English language translates very little comparatively. And so it's for the enriching of the literature itself rather than just for readers. Though I guess it's the readers who end up benefiting at the end of the day.
Yeah, but I'm also thinking, a lot of people who listen to this show are writers, and you probably would stand to benefit a great deal as a writer by reading works in translation, reading cross-culturally, just to get new ideas. Like you say, books are made differently in different places. I mean, there are some similarities that are fundamental, but there's certain angles that people take depending on where they come from, creatively speaking, that I think can be instructive. And Heather, before I lose this thread, I want to make sure to ask you, I know you said you grew up in New York City, but have you lived abroad? Do you have kind of an international existence? Where are you guys right now? I don't even know where you are.
I am actually in Mexico right now, in fact.
Oh, you are. And Julia, where are you?
I am not in Mexico, unfortunately. I am in Providence, Rhode Island.
Providence, Rhode Island. Okay, so Heather, though, tell me a little bit about your background as a traveler and how you I can't remember if you told me how you learned Spanish.
Sure. Also, just to follow up on something you just said before I lose that thread, another sort of plug for reading work in translation as a writer is that there's really interesting kind of formal experimentation happening in different literary contexts, right? Different approaches to storytelling and structure that are really enriching, and that I've seen. Julie and I have both been judges for translation prizes in recent years, and so we've seen sort of a large spectrum of work being translated from different languages, not just the ones that we work in. And there's really there are things in those books that I can only speak for myself, but there were things in those books that I read in those corpuses that I haven't seen in contemporary writing in English. So I think there is a lot to explore there. And as for my background, I grew up in New York City. I have lived in New York for most of my life, with a few years in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And now I think I'm going on 3 or 4 years in Mexico, in total. My partner's from here, and we're living here at the moment. Right now we're in the forest. We're in the mountains in the forest, which is very lovely. But usually we live in Mexico City.
Wow. The forest and the mountains. This sounds so like mystical.
It's beautiful. It is quite mystical.
Oh, what can I ask? Where? I mean, I don't need like a
Sure.
exact place, but just like what's the region?
It's the sort of the closest town is called Valle de Bravo, but we're like in a small town further away from the kind of center of that. And it's 2 hours outside of Mexico City. There's a lake and lots of very old pine trees, very tall, beautiful pines.
So if somebody is listening and they are bilingual or trilingual, you know, they have like a facility with a second or third language or something, and they are interested in possibly pursuing literary translation, like what do you say to that person? It seems like it's like I talked to Alejandro Zambra. I don't know if you guys are familiar with his work. He's a Chilean writer, and Megan McDowell, I think, is his translator. It's such a small world. I imagine you guys know the other translators. Maybe
Yes.
your competitors. Maybe you
It's
like.
a tiny,
No.
tiny world. We know basically everyone.
Yeah.
But we're
like
not
just like
competitive. It's funny.
No.
We're very
it's more of like
friendly with
a
each
it's like
other.
a tribe. Yeah, there's like a camaraderie. But you know, it's just like it just strikes me listening to you and then listening to her talk about her path into this line of work, going down to Chile and just like learning the language there, determined to learn it, learning it, you know, in all of its various specificities. And then I want to say like loving literature, reading literature in Chilean Spanish and wanting there to be a translation and just sort of playing with it, kind of falling into it. And then one project leads to the next. But like for somebody who might be aspiring or might be listening to this conversation going, oh, wow, I love books and I speak Spanish. Like, how do I do this? What would you tell that person?
The cynic in me says marry rich, or work at a bank for a while and save up a lot of money. The non-cynic in me says read widely, find your peers. I'm obsessed with the idea of finding your community as a translator because, especially in the US, unless you're based in New York, translators are really far flung. Your peer could be someone outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or in the mountains of Mexico City.
I was going to say in the forest and on the,
Yeah.
the mystical mountains of Mexico.
Yeah, sorry, not Mexico City, Mexico. And it can, I mean, at this point, I don't find it an especially lonely endeavor. I do a lot of co-translating, but also when you're translating, you feel very much in the company of the characters in the book, and also in the company of the authors, even though they have absolutely no idea that you're hanging out with them for like 8 hours a day and several weeks at a time. But yeah, find your peers, trust your intuition, but also always question your choices. Like always question your understanding and question what you've put on the page. Because language can be very slippery, and the way you read a sentence once can end up being wrong because you missed a single letter and a single word. And when your choice in English can also have implications that you didn't realize or nuances that you'd missed growing up. For people who know language very well, translators look at dictionaries quite often just to like triple check that the meaning that this word has the meaning they think it does, which is
Absolutely.
Heather,
just
anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to underscore what Julia said about, well, everything, but to really underscore what Julia said about reading a lot, right? Because as you said earlier, Brad, translation is writing, translation is creative writing. And in order to translate well, you really have to know what English can do. And then push it a little bit past what you've seen it do before in many cases. So that
Into
for
the poodle
sure.
realm.
Into the realm of the poodle, which might be the title of my memoir, if that's okay with the two of you, Into the Realm of the Poodle.
Of course, by all means.
Yeah, and as Julia said, to double check, triple check. If something sounds weird, go back and look at the original because often those little red flags will actually be pointing to something that you need to revisit. And I think the only thing I would add on that hasn't been said is do it because you want to do it. Do it because you love it. Don't start translating thinking that you're going to have a book contract in 6 months, because it's probably not going to work that way. I don't know how long Julia's path was before a first publication, but I think I was translating for 3 or 4 years before my first book came out. It's not quick. It's not financially lucrative, but it's incredibly rewarding. So, yeah.
I've heard that before on this literary podcast. Seems to be a theme.
Weird, huh?
Yeah, weird. Who knew? So I want to ask too about the collaboration process with the author. So you guys are on this episode talking about Reservoir Bitches and talking about your work as translators because Dahlia's English is not super fluent, or that was what I was told. But I am curious to know, in translating her work, about her creative involvement. I know she might not be able to evaluate like the English translation with like great skill, to like look at the word choices that you guys are making and to know what's what. That's sort of your job. But when you guys, as you were just describing, Heather, like run into a sticking point, or there's something that's like kind of bothering you or not quite working as well as you would like it to, do you then involve the author? Like, do you go back into dialogue with Dahlia? How often does that happen? And like, is there a pattern that you could point to from project to project in terms of like when you bring the author in? Like, do you do the translation, like plant your little red flags in the text and then go through it with them, like kind of inventory style, or is there a different way to do it?
I could jump in. Just yes, the answer is yes. That's exactly what I do. In this project, it worked very much that way. But over the course of the years, I have always gone through a full draft of the translation before reaching out to the author with queries, because I find that many times certain questions resolve themselves before the end. And the last thing I want is for the author to be like, this is really obvious. Why is she asking me this?
Yeah.
Because it's really important also that there's a lot of trust involved both ways in the relationship between an author and a translator. And so trying to be respectful of that and holding the questions until they're really clearly the questions that need to be asked. And then after that, yes, lots of dialogue. And I don't know, Julie, if you want to add to that.
I think that's about what I do as well. It changes author to author. There's some, I translate a couple of translators because in Spanish and Portuguese, it's not uncommon for authors to also translate books to make a living. And so I recently had a case where this Spanish author, Munira Chemi, who translates from English and Chinese into Spanish. He translated Lingma's Severance. I'm working on his new novel now, title still undetermined. And it's a sci-fi novel about translation. And he wrote an entire 15-page long document to assist translators. He tried to predict the kind of questions we might ask. And he also did this for concretely me as a translator, but for other potential translators for rights that had not yet been sold.
Okay, so was it helpful? Was it, or
it
was
was
it like
so helpful?
Oh, okay.
And some of it was as simple as, this is a typo, because sometimes you'll find a typo, you will believe that it is set in stone, and try really hard to figure out what this new word means that you haven't seen that way before, or if this repetition was intentional when really it should have been cut out. It was really helpful, and he's one of the few authors I actually sent like the full manuscript to, because translators they know that when you hand over your book to be translated, then you sort of lose ownership over it a little, and the book will go on to have another life in another language, and the translator tends to know what they're doing.
Authors love to be translated, even badly. I'd love to be translated even terribly, because then you could put that in your bio, like his work has been translated into 47 languages. They always have to put the number. You notice that, right?
Yes.
It's like a badge of honor, and a point of pride. But for people listening who might be in the book club or who might want to pick up Dahlia's collection, which is now available in English from our friends at the Feminist Press, like, what can you say as the translators of the collection about it that like distinguishes it? I mean, we've touched on some of this stuff, but you guys know this book as intimately as anybody, but maybe the author herself. And what can an English reader expect from the collection? I don't know who wants to jump in first, but just to give people an idea. Julia's pointing at her.
I knew you were going to do that. Well, I think it's a collection of loosely interwoven short stories. So there actually is something of an arc that you can trace. So even though these are discrete moments and discrete, as we've said, perspectives, there's a chance to really get emotionally involved with the characters and to kind of create. To feel that you're being kind of given a glimpse into a universe that is both politically very charged and also very sort of emotionally grounded. And one of the things that I love most about the collection is the way that it does have this kaleidoscopic quality. The stories are very different from one to another, even though there are certain themes that become repeated, the themes of violence and particularly gender-based violence, but not only. So yeah, that would be, I think that's one of the things that really makes this collection stand out. I don't know really anything else like it, and just the power of her voice in different manifestations.
Julia?
I would only add that it is a bit of an emotional roller coaster. You will weep and you will laugh your ass off, and you will wince. I've, like Heather was saying, I've not read anything like it written in English before. And this is her first book, and she is only going to write more fantastic works of literature. There's no one quite like Dahlia either.
There's no one like Dahlia.
And there's like an excitement about her work within the Mexican literary community.
Very much so.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, what are you guys working on next? Or are you like working on multiple projects at once? Are you co-translating other books, or are there anything in the works in along those lines? Well,
there's Dahlia's new book of short stories called Medea me cantó un corrido, which is about to come out in Mexico and is very exciting to see. I don't think either of us has quite read it yet, but
what's the translation of the title? I was trying to pick it up.
Medea, like the Greek Medea, sang me a corrido, and now you know what corridos are because we just want to. So
okay, yeah. the epic poems. I'm going to go have to
Yes.
listen to Spotify and get myself into some
You
corridos.
do. You will. It's a
they're
very rich rabbit hole to fall down.
I would also go on YouTube, though. Please, please go on YouTube and see some truly astonishing music videos.
Okay. Well, this has been enlightening. I love talking about this stuff. I'm a huge fan of reading work in translation. I want to do more of it always. And I think that, American readers in particular need to do more of this. And you guys did a wonderful job on this collection. And you have been very generous with your time and your insight. And I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.